This presentation aims to answer several questions about the impact that Swedish immigrants made in the greater Renovo area. What brought the Swedes to the Renovo area? Where did they come from? Who were they? What is their legacy? The people of Sweden have a rich history and culture that we can see today in our own country. Sweden is located in the northern hemisphere in Scandinavia, next to Norway, Finland, and Denmark. The first migration to America in the 1600s led to the creation of the New Sweden colony along the Delaware River in what is now Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Long before New Sweden, the Lenape people lived in this region until the U.S. government forced them to relocate west in the 19th century. The colony only lasted a short 17 years and emigration out of Sweden became restricted for centuries. It was illegal for anyone to leave the country without an official royal decree. These restrictions succeeded in raising Sweden's population, but caused overpopulation and famine. After 1840 these laws were loosened and a significant number of immigrants from Sweden arrived in port cities like New York and Boston. From there, the Swedes moved westward into the Midwest and excelled in farming in states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. The Homestead Act of 1862 granted citizens or intended citizens up to 160 acres of land after making continuous improvements for 5 years and offered a chance for immigrants that was not available in their home countries. Immigration from Sweden happened in a few different waves. In 1626, King Gustavus Adolphus signed the first charter that would lead to Swedish exploration in the New World. In 1638, first Swedish exploration of the Delaware River led to the New Sweden colony. In 1655, New Sweden fell to the Dutch and emigration was restricted. In 1664, England gained control of the New Sweden colony. 1682, William Penn arrived in Newcastle and founded Philadelphia, promising religious freedom. Swedes would have to wait at least another 100 years until emigration out of Sweden is permitted. After 1840, Swedish emigration rules relaxed and Swedes began moving to the U.S. along with other European immigrants. Immigration continued steadily after the Civil War until World War I and ending the mass migration of all immigrants into the United States. Between 1869 and 1900, almost 800,000 Swedish immigrants had made their new home in the United States, with a large population living in Chicago, making it the second largest Swedish city in the world after Stockholm. Steamships by the late 1880s made the journey from Sweden only a 10 to 12-day trip, although conditions were rough on board as many traveled in the holds on cargo ships. By the end of the 19th century, the Renovo area had become a melting pot of different ethnicities and backgrounds. Scandinavians left their homes in search of better economic opportunities and found work in the railroad shops and coal mines. The Swedes who came to Renovo came from different hometowns, including Halmstad, Brålanda, and Nossebro. The lumber boom also attracted many Scandinavian immigrants in the region. Lumber baron and Civil War Colonel Thomas L. Kane, famous for his role in the Buckdale's Volunteer Infantry and the namesake of Kane, PA, recruited them to clear and harvest the Pennsylvania forests in McKean and Elk counties. Kane and other businessmen placed target advertisements in Swedish newspapers that promised a better life in a new world. Promises of cheap land and steady work drew thousands to rural Pennsylvania during this time period in exchange for a prepaid steerage ticket on a steamship to New York. Emigrant agent firms like the Larson Brothers and Company facilitated the journey with steamship lines like Inman Line, American Line, and White Star Line. Ships like the SS Paris departed from Gothenburg, Sweden to Liverpool, England, then on to New York, and finally on to towns like Bradford or Mount Jewett. Additionally, letters from family and friends often encouraged those back home to make the 2-week journey in pursuit of new opportunities, and often would house new immigrants in their homes to ease the transition. Let's take a look at the Swedish population centers in the Renovo area, starting with Renovo and South Renovo, and then we'll discuss by two men. In 1880 there were 67 Swedish-born residents living in Renovo, which was about 11% of all the immigrant population in the borough. Out of all residents though, the Swedes accounted for just under 2% of the entire population. By 1910, they made up 18.5% of all immigrants in Renovo, but overall dropped to 1.5% of all the residents in the borough due to the growth of total residents. Interestingly, from 1870 to 1920, almost 500 Swedes listed Renovo as their emigration destination. The railroad shops provided jobs for working men of all ages. Wives and children would often follow later, or sometimes families would make the journey together. While the railroad shops were located in Renovo proper, many workers lived in South Renovo and made the walk over town via a bridge across the Susquehanna River. South Renovo wasn't officially established until 1888, but the 1900 census reveals that 48 residents were born in Sweden, out of 425 total residents, or about 11%. By 1910, South Renovo's population doubled to 805, with 63 residents who were born in Sweden. While more Swedish-born residents were living in South Renovo in 1910, the growth of the overall population caused this percentage to shrink to about 8%. Outside of Westport in Noyes Township, just a few miles away from Renovo, is Bitumen. This area west of Renovo attracted many immigrants due to the bituminous coal beds that lay underneath that needed to be mined. Today, Bitumen is somewhat of a ghost town, but at one point it was once called one of the prettiest coal towns in the state. In 1900, the Swedish population of all Scandinavians in Noyes Township was 35% and Finns made up the other 65%. By 1910, the ratios were nearly the same, with Swedes accounting for 33%, Finns 66%, and 1% Norwegian. Finnish and Swedish immigrants both spoke Swedish as their main language during this time period, as Finland had once been part of Sweden from the 1200s to 1809 and shared a similar culture and heritage. The Kettle Creek Coal Company owned and operated the coal mines in Bitumen and employed around 400 to 500 men in 1905. Slovaks and Scandinavians comprised the majority of the workforce, yet Finns outnumbered Swedes nearly 2 to 1. This immigration chart shows that Swedes started emigrating to the U.S. earlier than Finns, as our first Scandinavian immigrant noted in Bitumen arrived in 1874. While farming was one way the Swedes made their way in America, particularly out west, in the Renovo area, the railroad and coal mines were their largest employers. Women mostly worked, keeping house, or other home-based roles like laundress or servants. Other jobs held by immigrants included blacksmith, brakeman, machinist, dressmaker, clerk, butcher, carpenter, pastor, conductor, tailor, electrician and clothing agent. The immigrant labor contribution to the economic success of the Renovo area at the turn of the 19th century should not be overlooked. Their labor was instrumental in growing and sustaining the railroad industry. The trains didn't run or repair themselves on their own accord, just as the bituminous coal did not mine itself in Noyes Township. Alongside native Pennsylvanians, a diverse array of employees from all over, including Scandinavia, undoubtedly boosted the economy in Renovo with their hard work. Of course, occupations of Scandinavians depended on where they lived in the area. From the 1880 Renovo census, we find many Swedish railroad employees with jobs such as blacksmith, carpenter, machinist, clerk, and laborer. There were also several families who had butchers, Bengtsson, Carlson, and Johnson. Other jobs Swedes held were tailor, servant, and landlord. Moving ahead to 1910, more railroad jobs are noted, such as conductor, brakeman, car inspector, roundhouse helper, ostler, and car cleaner. We also see other jobs in the community, like electrician, pastor, brewery wagon driver, and dressmaker. Over in South Renovo in 1910, more residents worked for the railroad in jobs like ticket agent, upholsterer, laborer, carpenter, boilermaker, and machinist. In Bitumen, the vast majority of all residents in 1900 and 1910 worked in the coal mines. However, there were a few notable other occupations noted in the 1900 census. These included servants, track foreman, carpenter, clothing agent, and farmer. Coal miners had the hardest jobs in the area and faced the most hazards at work. In 1888, an explosion killed several miners, many if not all were immigrants. The article in the Daily Gazette and Bulletin sensationally covered the event, which was typical for newspapers during this era. It reads, 17 killed. Terrible mine disaster at Kettle Creek. It occurred Saturday afternoon and is followed with frightful loss of life. The deadly mine gas the cause. Mangled victims, in all caps, 14 of the men killed outright. And the others die soon afterwards, only a few escape. Latest details from the scene of death. A telegram was received in this city at 6 o'clock Saturday night stating that a terrible disaster had occurred at Cook's Run, Clinton County, in the mine of the Kettle Creek Coal and Mining Company. Samuel Killinger, Patrick Donnelly, Michael Curran and Jay Carlson were the only English-speaking men among the killed, the others being Italian and Hungarians. At the end of the article, a theory blames improper dynamite purchased by an Italian worker before mentioning that John and Aaron Anderson are badly injured but will recover. The anti-immigrant sentiment of the news is clear in the language used, and by today's standards, the writing seems inappropriate and insensitive. Not only were non-native English speakers looked down upon in this article, but Hungarians and Italians who were killed in the explosion were not even named. The story was also printed in other newspapers, including the New York Times. No matter where Swedish immigrants lived within the Renovo area, they had a common bond with one another that stretched back to their homeland. If we look at the last names in Renovo in 1880 based on the census schedule, the largest represented family among Swedish immigrants were the Carlsons, followed by the Johnson, Bengtsson, and Anderson families. Jumping forward to 1910 in Renovo, the Carlsons are still the largest group, along with Bengtsson, Anderson, and Johnson. However, we see a growth in the Hoagland, Selberg, and Nelsons, along with the Bensons, Swansons, and Netsons. Looking across the river in 1910 to South Renovo, the family names are more evenly distributed among the census records. Anderson, Johnson, Nelson, Carlson, Larsson, Benson, Gullbord, Bergdahl, Sten, Eriksson, and Ekdahl were all Swedish families in the borough. As we look at Bitumen in 1900, there are a lot of Finnish and Swedish names noted in the census. Again, Carlson, Johnson, and Anderson were the largest represented families in Noise Township. Additionally, we can see the Wickman, Cabrelson, Whitman, Gustafsson, Olsson, Helsing, and Swanson families living in Bitumen, along with many more fellow Scandinavians. A shared heritage united many Swedish-Americans, and Renovo residents often would travel to other towns for weddings, funerals, or sometimes reunions, just to stay connected to their Swedish roots. In 1922, miners in Bitumen went on strike. The Kettle Creek Coal Company owned the houses the miners lived in and evicted them, leaving them homeless. Some residents left the area for new jobs, but some relocated to Renovo to work in the shops or other jobs. In 1935, an article in the Lock Haven Express titled, Bitumen, Flourishing Town Then a Deserted Village, Now Begins to Come Back, the author wrote about life in Bitumen during its heyday. The article states, the population was about equally divided between Swedes and Slavs, blonde for the most part, many of them with truly golden hair that would be the despair of movie stars and beauty parlor operators. Of course, all that coal dust from the mine probably made their tresses somewhat less golden. Years after the mines had closed, reunions of former residents took place at nearby Kettle Creek State Park. These meetings brought together old friends and families who had moved away from Bitumen long ago, yet shared a connection that reached far away to their native homelands. 15 years ago, Bitumen was a busy, thriving village of about 1,000 inhabitants. There were several churches, a store, 4 public schools, and a parochial school with several priests and 4 or 5 nuns in charge. Then came the strike, and the miners and their families went north, south, east or west, wherever a job or the promise of a job beckoned. As there was no place at Bitumen large enough for the crowd, they met at the park on Kettle Creek at Summerson's Run, where they exchanged greetings, met long-separated friends and relatives. The urge that brings these people from far away to meet each other here for so short a time is perhaps explained by the fact that most of them are foreigners, and the longing for the homeland is partly satisfied by this meeting with compatriots or those whose home in the old country adjoined their own. It is a worthwhile thing to do, and those of us who live here are glad to welcome them back even for a brief stay. In 1971, the Express covered the reunion of former bitumen residents, which had become an annual tradition by this point. The article notes at the end that these reunions have been held for 54 years. On July 4th, the annual bitumen reunion was held at Kettle Creek State Park at the Bush Dam site, with a large crowd of former residents, friends, and relatives present. The reunion guests once lived in the mining town of Bitumen on the mountaintop above Westport. They were of different nationalities and religions: Slavs, Swedes, Norwegians, Finns. Other reunions took place at more somber events. Fred and Mary Sten of South Renovo journeyed to Wilcox in Elk County for the funeral of a relative, John Mom, in 1940. Mom's obituary included many recognizable Scandinavian family names that we also see in Renovo and Bitumen. In addition to the Stens, Mr. and Mrs. Magnus Kjellberg attended the funeral. Wilcox was a hub for many Swedish immigrants during the lumber boom, and many Renovo residents had connections to this small town. John August Benson once lived in Wilcox before living in Renovo. He was born in a small village called Morup in Halland County, Sweden in 1836. He and his first wife Nellie and her children from a previous marriage lived in Halmstad in factory housing as John worked in a textile mill. Intrigued by the work offered in the northern tier of Pennsylvania, the family emigrated to Wilcox, but then returned to Sweden in 1874 for a short period before making another voyage back to the U.S. and settling in Renovo. They lived on 12th Street in Renovo in 1880, and John worked as a railroad laborer. By 1910, John's wife Nellie had died and he married Benna Suderberg, another Swedish immigrant also from Halmstad. They raised their family at 215 Pennsylvania Avenue in South Renovo, and John worked in the foundry. The legacy of Swedish immigrants in the Renovo area can be seen today in town through architecture and community spirit. As Swedish immigrants made their new lives in Renovo, they also established new churches in the late 1880s that further united their shared ancestry. 1889 would see the establishment of 2 Swedish churches in Renovo. In May of 1889, 12 men and women gathered in home or rented halls after Reverend John Isaacson of Titusville, PA, established the Swedish Evangelical Church in Renovo to serve the growing number of Swedish families. The Swedish Congregational Church was dedicated in 1895 at 227 8th Street in Renovo, with Reverend David Marcellus and Reverend Isaacson led the services in both English and Swedish. The church continued with a succession of reverends, and by the early 1920s, English was the standard language for all services as the congregation became more Americanized. In 1922, the name was changed to the Swedish Mission Church. In November of 1889, a group of 25 Swedish members of Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church broke away to establish a new congregation with about 60 other worshippers. This became St. John's Swedish Lutheran Church. In November of 1889, a group of 25 Swedish members of Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church broke away to establish a new congregation with about 60 other worshippers. This became St. John's Swedish Lutheran Church. Upon its incorporation, the first church deacons were elected: Nils Andersson, Carl Alfred Swanson, Charles Selberg, Per W. Carlson, Svante Johnson, August Selberg. The first trustees were Carl Freiberg, Magnus Persson, Charles J. Johnson, Nils Andersson, Nils A. Olander, Ola Goransson, and Anders E. Stahlgren. It took until 1895 for the church to be completed and dedicated at the corner of 8th Streets and Ontario Avenue. The lot was purchased for $3,000, with construction on the foundation starting in 1892. The Panic of 1893, however, delayed completion, as most congregants were employed by the railroad and faced layoffs, leading to less money being donated to the church's building fund. In 1902, newly ordained Reverend J.R. Regner started his tenure at St. John's Swedish Lutheran Church and welcomed a period of growth and prosperity. In 1904, the church's interior was decorated along with the purchase of a new organ. Electric lights and a steam heating system were also installed at this time. In 1906, Reverend Regner and his wife moved into the new parsonage on 8th Street. In 1908, Reverend Regner had his appendix removed at the Williamsport Hospital. The Daily Gazette reported that the Renovo minister was recovering and would be returning home soon. 1909, Reverend Regner organized the Swedish Evangelical Lutheran Church of Bitumen, with congregation members from St. John's serving as pastors. In 1920, Reverend Carl O. Bostrom of Saskatchewan, Canada took charge of the church. The church at this point had a male choir, who sang at a Christmas program in 1925 at the New Pennsylvania Railroad's YMCA gym. Choir members included first tenors, William Hallberg, Carl Hogg, Theodore Persson, second tenors, Gustav Hallberg, Harold Hogg, Theodore Pearson, Reverend G. H. Baumgren, baritones, George Askland, Carl Bergdahl, basses, Ernest Peterson, John Lundfeldt. Outside of the railroad, Swedish immigrants and their families lived alongside the rest of the population and touched the entire community. Many had children and put down roots, and those children had families. The Gullborg family in South Renovo would eventually own and operate J.W. Gullborg and Company's store for several decades at 166 Pennsylvania Avenue. J.W. Gullborg's mother was Augusta and was born in Bralanda, Sweden in 1864. She emigrated in 1883 to Williamsport, PA, where she married Gustav in 1895 before the family moved to Renovo. Mrs. Gullborg died in 1953 at the age of 88. Another famous second-generation Swede was Carl Johnson, a well-known butcher for Weiss Markets before his death in 1959. The son of Charles and Annette Benson Johnson, both Swedish immigrants, Carl was born in Renovo in 1890. He took over his father's business when he died, as he had learned his trade from him. Carl was also a World War I veteran and left behind some family members in Renovo. Finally, we end with the death of Andrew Anderson, who died at the age of 90 in 1962. His obituary reads, Mr. Anderson, Bitumen, dies. Miner, 90, once gold prospector. Renovo, Andrew Anderson, 90, of Bitumen, a native of Sweden, coal miner and farmer here much of his life, and unsuccessful gold prospector in western United States, died at the home of his son, Birger, at 8:10 a.m. today. Frail health had resulted in his being bedfast the past 5 years. During 3.5 years of that time he lived with his son. His home was next door to his son's. Mr. Anderson was born in Nossebro, Sweden, where a brother, Peter, still lives. He came to America in 1897 and worked for the Kettle Creek Coal Mining Company and later farmed at Bitumen until his health failed. His adventurous gold mining trip took him to Montana and other western states, but he didn't strike it rich. Mr. Anderson's wife, the former Anna Marie Sten, whom he married in 1900, died on December 28, 1951. He leaves his son, 2 daughters, Mrs. Agnes Stenman, home, PA, Mrs. Henry Kisco, Bitumen, 20 grandchildren, 49 great-grandchildren and 2 great-great-grandchildren. A daughter, Mrs. Lillian Palmer, died 24 years ago. Mr. Anderson was a member of St. John's Lutheran Church in Renovo.